I am Brenda, 35 years old. For 11 years, my family never once cared about what I actually did for a living. They simply assumed I was their incompetent daughter struggling with an endless string of unstable jobs. I smiled and accepted their contempt, using it as a perfect shield to separate myself from their toxic expectations and bottomless greed. That quiet facade shattered the moment my phone lit up with a text message from my grandmother. 6 simple words that carried the weight of a boulder. Send me the cake recipe. Anyone else would have thought it was a harmless baking question, but I knew it wasn't a mistake. That was the emergency distress code she and I had established 18 years ago. We promised it would only be used if she was ever trapped, stripped of her freedom, and completely controlled by someone else. In a fraction of a second, the mask of the useless failure was gone. It was replaced by the cold, calculated mind of a senior financial fraud investigator. My family thought I was harmless, but they were about to learn how dangerously wrong they were. I had no time to waste. I immediately began planning a ruthless legal counterattack to protect the only person in that bloodline who ever actually loved me. Have you ever had to hide your true strength to protect yourself from your own family? Or watch someone you love suffer in silence and realized you were their only hope? Leave a comment below and let me know. We share stories like this every day, stories about standing your ground, exposing toxic relatives, and delivering undeniable justice. If you want to see exactly how this trap unfolds, please subscribe so you don't miss a single detail. 45 minutes after the message arrived, my tires scraped against the curb as I parked in the shadows exactly 2 blocks away from the red brick house in Portland, Maine. I turned off the engine and rolled down the window. The crisp air filled the cabin, but my focus remained entirely on the property down the street. Something was immediately wrong with the exterior. Every single curtain was drawn tightly shut, blocking any view of the inside. More concerning were the 4 brand-new security cameras mounted high at the corners of the roof. They were positioned strategically, leaving 0 blind spots around the entire perimeter of the yard. I picked up my phone and opened a specialized wireless network scanning application that I utilized frequently for financial fraud field investigations. The screen quickly populated with local signals from the neighborhood. Within seconds, I identified the specific network transmitting from the router inside the house. I analyzed the traffic data. The outbound data packets were massive and continuous. Those exterior cameras were not simply recording footage to a local hard drive sitting on a desk inside the living room. They were actively streaming high-definition video directly to a remote cloud storage server 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Whoever installed that advanced system wanted real-time, uninterrupted surveillance of the property from their own devices. I stayed in my vehicle and observed the street until I spotted the familiar postal worker walking down the sidewalk. I stepped out of the car and intercepted him near the corner intersection. "Excuse me, sir," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. "I am Martha's granddaughter. I was hoping to drop in and surprise her, but the house looks completely locked down." The mail carrier paused and adjusted the heavy strap on his shoulder. "I haven't actually seen her in quite a while, to be honest." "Really?" I asked, feigning mild confusion. "Not even to sign for the certified packages?" He shook his head firmly. "No. For the past 4 months, her son or his new wife always answers the door to take the mail. They told me she is too weak to come to the front porch anymore." I thanked him, walked back to my car, and locked the doors. That brief conversation confirmed the isolation tactic. I opened my laptop connected to a secure mobile hotspot and accessed the City of Portland's public real estate records portal. I navigated through the county clerk's database and typed in the exact address of the property. The search results loaded on my screen, revealing a recent update. There was a pending legal notice attached directly to the property deed. Someone had recently filed official paperwork requesting a transfer of the primary beneficiary and legal ownership. The application was currently under municipal review, but it proved the underlying financial motive. They were actively making a legal move to seize her assets. My initial instinct was to dial the police dispatch and demand an immediate welfare check. I placed my finger over the phone screen to make the call, but professional logic quickly took over. A sudden police visit would yield absolutely nothing. Without concrete, undeniable proof of a criminal offense, law enforcement officers would only see an elderly woman being cared for by her relatives. The police would leave, and the family would instantly realize they were being investigated. They would restrict my physical access permanently, leaving her completely trapped. I closed the laptop and put it away. The only way to gather actionable legal evidence was from the inside of that house. I needed to walk through that front door without triggering their defenses. I decided to stick to the script they had already written for me. I would use their own arrogance as my entry ticket. At 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, I knocked on the front door of the house holding a tin box of cookies, wearing my usual clueless expression. The deadbolt clicked, and the door opened just a few inches. My stepmother Susan stood in the narrow gap with a deeply suspicious look in her eyes. She gripped the edge of the door firmly, her body angled to actively block my path into the hallway. I lifted the tin box and offered a naive smile, but her expression hardened into an irritated scowl. She did not offer a greeting. Instead, she quickly claimed that Martha was severely ill and needed absolute quiet. Susan aggressively insisted that this was a terrible time for visitors and began to push the door shut. Before the lock could engage, a voice echoed from the hallway. My father, Richard, stepped into view. He glanced nervously over my shoulder toward the open street, clearly anxious about the neighbors noticing a scene on his front porch. He placed a hand on Susan's shoulder and pulled the door open wider, breaking her defensive stance. "Just let her in, Susan," Richard said dismissively. "What could she possibly do that you have to worry about?" Susan stepped aside reluctantly, and I walked straight into the living room. The air inside felt thick and artificially warm. I immediately located Martha sitting rigidly on the large floral sofa. My investigative instincts recorded every detail of her condition. She looked shockingly frail, her face pale and her posture hunched. I quickly scanned the side table next to her. Her thick reading glasses were missing, making it impossible for her to read documents. The cordless telephone that usually sat next to her lamp was also gone, cutting off her outside access. Despite her weakened physical state, she raised her head when she heard my footsteps. Her eyes locked onto mine for a fraction of a second. She silently signaled that she recognized my presence and understood why I was there. A moment later, my brother Robert walked out of the kitchen holding a mug of premium coffee. He stopped in his tracks, looking me up and down with an unmistakable sneer. He fixated on my faded jacket and scuffed shoes, intentionally emphasizing the gap between his perceived success and my fabricated failure. He took a slow sip of his coffee and shook his head mockingly. "Lost your job again?" Robert asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "This house doesn't have any money for you to borrow to pay your bills." Richard walked over and joined Robert, folding his arms across his chest. Both of them stood there entirely focused on analyzing my cheap clothes and lecturing me about financial responsibility. They were completely blinded by their own arrogance. I kept my shoulders slumped, playing the role of the humiliated daughter perfectly. I shuffled awkwardly toward the sofa and sat down next to Martha. I placed the tin box of cookies directly onto her lap. While Richard and Robert loudly continued their condescending tirade about my lack of ambition, I smoothly unlatched the metal lid. My hands moved quickly under the cover. I slid a fully charged burner phone out from beneath the bottom layer of parchment paper. With one fluid motion, I pushed the device deep into the folds of the blanket draped over Martha's legs. I gave her hand a brief, firm squeeze under the fabric. She squeezed back instantly, acknowledging the drop. The transfer was complete, and they suspected absolutely nothing. At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the heavy oak desk in my private office was completely buried under dozens of printed financial statement files, bank ledgers, and property tax records that required my immediate attention. The clueless, incompetent facade I had worn over the weekend was officially removed. In reality, I am a senior financial fraud investigator, a high-level position I had deliberately kept off all social media platforms and out of casual conversations for over a decade. This strict professional secrecy was specifically designed to avoid the endless scrutiny and greedy financial demands of my family. I spent my daily professional life dissecting complex corporate embezzlement schemes and tracking hidden offshore accounts, making me uniquely qualified to tear apart whatever crude financial trap my father and stepmother had set. They vastly underestimated my capabilities. The glass door to my office swung open, breaking the silence of the early morning. My legal partner Harrison walked in carrying a thick manila folder stamped with a red official seal. He bypassed the guest chairs and placed the heavy document directly in the center of my desk. It was the emergency court ruling we had filed for, granting us the immediate legal authority to unseal the entirety of my family's private trust fund records. We now held unrestricted lawful access to every single transaction, history, wire transfer, and legal modification associated with Martha's estate spanning the last 5 years. This level of transparency left absolutely no room for them to hide their malicious activities. We immediately began cross-referencing the long columns of numbers against the historical baseline of her main account. The discrepancies were glaring and mathematically impossible to ignore. Within minutes, we discovered the exact mechanism of their theft. Richard and Susan had recently submitted a new, comprehensive power of attorney document to the primary financial institution managing the trust. This fraudulent paperwork was aggressively designed to grant them total, unchallenged control over the primary banking account's investment portfolios and real estate holdings. Harrison leaned over the desk, carefully comparing the newly submitted document with a verified legal sample we pulled from the secure archive. The signature on this POA is a highly sophisticated copy, but the pen pressure does not match your grandmother's original records, he stated, pointing at the slight hesitations in the ink strokes. I pulled up the subpoenaed email correspondence linked to the bank's communication portal to track their next move. Scanning through the recent sent messages, I found a deeply incriminating exchange between Richard and a local mobile notary service. The emails outlined a clear, time-sensitive schedule. They had booked the notary to arrive at the Portland house this coming weekend. Their ultimate objective was crystal clear. They intended to force Martha to physically sign the final deed transfer, effectively stripping her of the house ownership before moving her to a substandard facility. This forced signature would finalize their complete takeover of her wealth. Send the TPO to the bank immediately, I instructed him sharply, my eyes locked on the digital schedule. We have to stop the cash flow before they can liquidate the assets. Harrison nodded in agreement and immediately began drafting the temporary protective order on his laptop. This specific legal instrument would be electronically transmitted directly to the bank's Central Fraud Prevention Department. Once the system processed the document, it would act as an invisible, impenetrable wall. The order would silently freeze all major withdrawal transactions, decline any new credit lines, and block any attempt to transfer the property title out of the trust. We were methodically locking them inside a secure financial cage. They would continue to believe they had absolute power, completely unaware that the trap had already snapped shut until the exact moment they tried to access the stolen money. At 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, I sat across from my best friend Claire at an empty coffee shop in the suburbs. I stared blankly at my dark coffee, feeling the intense, suffocating pressure of the ongoing investigation weighing heavily on my shoulders. The raw urge to drive straight to Portland, break down the front door, and aggressively confront my family was nearly overwhelming. My best friend Claire recognized the dangerous, rigid tension building in my posture. She served as my critical emotional anchor, actively preventing me from making impulsive, rage-driven mistakes that could compromise the entire operation. She understood that storming the property without backup would simply give Richard the perfect opportunity to destroy crucial physical documents and manipulate the official narrative to local law enforcement. "You have endured this for 11 years," Claire said, keeping her tone calm but incredibly firm. "Do not let temporary anger ruin a perfect legal plan." I took a slow, deep breath, allowing her rational perspective to ground my racing thoughts. Exactly at that moment, a specialized encrypted application on my personal phone began vibrating silently against the wooden table. It was the secure, untraceable line connected directly to the burner device I had successfully smuggled inside the tin cookie box over the weekend. I answered the call, immediately pressing the speaker tightly against my ear to ensure absolute privacy. "Granddaughter, the doctor confirmed my mind is sharper than all of theirs combined," Martha whispered through the receiver, her voice vibrating with a renewed, undeniable sense of strength and defiance. She quickly informed me that she had successfully completed the remote cognitive evaluation via a secure video link with the independent court-appointed geriatric psychiatrist. The official medical assessment formally concluded that she was entirely lucid, highly capable of making her own independent financial decisions, and suffering only from intentional physical isolation and systemic emotional manipulation. This definitive medical document was the ultimate weapon in our legal arsenal. It completely annihilated Richard's fabricated claims that she lacked mental capacity, destroying his primary justification for pursuing involuntary guardianship over her massive estate. Before our brief, hushed conversation even ended, a secondary flashing notification popped up on my laptop screen. The banking system's automated security protocol had just triggered a high-priority financial alert. I quickly opened the encrypted banking portal to review the live data stream. Susan was currently standing at an airline ticket counter, aggressively attempting to purchase 2 expensive first-class flights to Europe using Martha's primary credit account. The system operated exactly as Harrison and I had programmed it to function. The temporary protective order engaged instantly. The merchant terminal flatly declined the high-value transaction, locking the card entirely to prevent any further unauthorized charges. The invisible financial cage was officially active. My stepmother was now stranded at the airport terminal with a useless piece of plastic, completely unaware that her illicit financial lifeline had been permanently severed by the legal system. Armed with the irrefutable medical evaluation and the newly blocked transaction data, I initiated the final preparatory phase of my strategy. I immediately dialed the emergency operational director at Maine's Adult Protective Services. I systematically shared the concrete evidence of ongoing financial exploitation and the verified threat of physical confinement. Together, we meticulously coordinated a tactical intervention strategy specifically scheduled for Saturday morning. The joint operation required absolute flawless precision. We needed to secure the perimeter and extract the vulnerable victims safely without alerting the perpetrators prematurely or causing a volatile domestic standoff inside the residence. I provided the state agency with a detailed architectural layout of the property, including the exact locations of the newly installed exterior security cameras, ensuring our approach would remain entirely undetected. Every variable was calculated, leaving Richard and Susan absolutely no avenue for escape. At 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, the air in my grandmother's living room reeked of fresh printer ink from the thick stack of property transfer documents that had just been aggressively placed on the glass coffee table. Richard and Susan stood towering over Martha, pressing tightly against both sides of her fragile shoulders. They had effectively trapped her on the sofa, using their bodies to block any possible escape route. Richard shoved a heavy black pen into her trembling hand. He repeatedly tapped his index finger against the blank signature line of the final deed relinquishment form. He leaned in uncomfortably close to her face, employing a classic psychological isolation tactic to break her remaining willpower. "Sign this right now. Do you want to spend the rest of your days in that disgusting, stinking asylum?" Richard demanded cruelly, completely unaware that his timeline had expired. Before the metal tip of the pen could make contact with the legal paper, I pushed the heavy wooden front door wide open. It slammed forcefully against the hallway wall with a deafening crack, instantly freezing everyone in the room. I marched straight into the center of the living room, projecting an overwhelming, commanding presence that permanently shattered their manufactured illusion of absolute control. I was no longer the hunched, pathetic failure they had mocked and dismissed just a few days prior. I walked with the precise, calculated authority of a senior investigator executing a coordinated enforcement raid. Following closely behind me was Harrison, clutching a leather folder filled with executed court warrants, followed instantly by two fully uniformed local police officers equipped with tactical gear. "Put the pen down. The charade of liars officially ends right here," I ordered loudly, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension with absolute authority. A legitimate licensed notary public was standing awkwardly in the far corner of the room, clutching his official state embosser. He looked extremely uncomfortable with the hostile domestic dynamic, but had been hired purely to verify a signature. He had absolutely no idea he was being actively manipulated into facilitating a massive felony fraud operation. The moment Harrison stepped forward and held up the official temporary protective order bearing the embossed red seal of the state court, the notary's face drained of all color. He realized the severe legal jeopardy he was standing in. He immediately backed away from the documents, throwing both hands up in a frantic defensive gesture. "I have nothing to do with this. I had no idea they were forcing her." The notary stammered loudly, hurriedly packing his stamping equipment into his briefcase to distance himself from the criminal conspiracy. Robert had been sitting cross-legged in the leather armchair, casually sipping a glass of iced water while complacently watching his parents terrorize our grandmother. The exact moment I entered the room, flanked by armed law enforcement, his body froze entirely. His trademark arrogant smirk vanished in an instant. His wide eyes locked onto the official senior financial fraud investigator badge, securely clipped to the lapel of my tailored blazer. The sheer overwhelming shock of realizing the sister he had consistently despised and financially degraded was actually a high-ranking legal authority caused his hand to go completely limp. The heavy glass slipped directly from his fingers, shattering loudly against the hardwood floor, sending water and ice sliding across the room. He remained paralyzed, unable to utter a single syllable. The two police officers immediately moved forward, executing their tactical instructions flawlessly to establish a secure physical perimeter around the sofa. They firmly ordered Richard and Susan to step back immediately, physically separating the perpetrators from Martha. I walked straight through the secured perimeter and gently extracted the pen from her shaking fingers. Martha looked up at me, letting out a long, exhausted breath of pure relief as she finally relaxed against the cushions. She was safely extracted from their coercive grip. Richard, suddenly realizing his meticulous scheme to steal the trust fund was rapidly collapsing, began to panic wildly. His face turned bright red as he threw his arms in the air, aggressively demanding an explanation from the officers. He screamed hysterically that this was his private family residence, and I had zero legal right to intrude, completely oblivious to the fact that his legal destruction was already set in motion. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, the furious sound of my father pounding his fist against the metal table echoed throughout the drab gray waiting room of the police precinct. He was secured inside one of the primary interrogation rooms. Through the live audio feed, I listened as the meticulously crafted image of the dutiful son completely collapsed. Richard was frantically weaving a pathetic string of clumsy lies to justify his dictatorial surveillance over Martha. He loudly claimed to the detectives that the security cameras, the confiscated communication devices, and the barred doors were strictly implemented for her physical safety. He desperately attempted to paint himself as an overwhelmed caregiver, forced to make difficult medical decisions, trying to manipulate the police officers just as easily as he had manipulated our family. I did not allow his theatrical performance to continue. I pushed the heavy reinforced door open and stepped directly into the cramped interrogation room, flanked closely by the lead financial crimes detective. Susan sat rigidly in the corner, her jaw tightly clenched in silent denial. I walked straight up to the metal table and forcefully dropped a massive binder directly in front of them. The thick file contained the irrefutable forensic bank statements detailing every dollar they had illegally diverted from the primary trust accounts. Right on top, I placed the certified handwriting analysis report proving the signature on the new power of attorney was a sophisticated forgery. The undeniable weight of the physical evidence instantly shut down all of Susan's potential legal escape routes. Her defensive posture crumpled immediately as she realized the sheer magnitude of the felony fraud charges. I stepped back out into the observation corridor. Through the adjacent one-way mirror, I observed my brother Robert sitting nervously in a separate interrogation room. The exact moment the detectives informed him of the potential federal conspiracy charges, his trademark arrogant demeanor completely evaporated. I watched with deep disgust as he hastily began recording an official sworn statement. He was frantically throwing both Richard and Susan under the bus, volunteering every operational detail of their fraudulent scheme to negotiate an immunity deal. He eagerly pinned all the financial blame on his father and stepmother, just to find a quick way out, fully exposing the utter moral rot of this family. While Robert was actively betraying his parents, Harrison approached the precinct commander. He officially submitted the binding legal documents directly authorized by Martha earlier that morning. The paperwork permanently removed Richard as a designated beneficiary, entirely stripping him from the family trust fund and legally erasing him from her last will and testament. Furthermore, Harrison formally filed an emergency protective order on Martha's behalf, legally banning Robert from coming within 100 yards of her residence under the strict threat of immediate arrest. I walked back into Richard's interrogation room for one final interaction. He glared up at me, his chest heaving with unrestrained fury. "You are an ungrateful daughter. I was only trying to protect the assets of this house," Richard shouted, his face contorted with rage as his restricted wrists clinked loudly against the metal chair. I looked straight into his bloodshot eyes, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the greedy man sitting in front of me. "No, you were protecting your own greed, and now you will have to pay the price for it," I replied coldly. I explicitly told him that their blind arrogance had handed me the perfect operational cover. Their relentless contempt gave me the exact time and freedom needed to cast this airtight legal net right under their noses. 3 months later, the warm autumn sunlight streamed directly through the large glass window of my grandmother's new high-security luxury apartment. The brutal legal consequences of that Saturday morning raid had arrived with crushing, irreversible force. Richard and Susan were currently facing a multitude of severe federal criminal charges, specifically including felony elder abuse, criminal conspiracy, and aggravated financial fraud. Denied bail by a federal judge due to the overwhelming forensic evidence, the forged power of attorney, and the severe risk of flight, they remained securely locked inside a Cold County detention center, anxiously awaiting their criminal trial. Their meticulously constructed upper-class reputation was entirely annihilated, replaced by permanent public disgrace and the terrifying reality of impending lengthy prison sentences. They lost absolutely everything they had ruthlessly tried to steal. Robert's arrogant, superficial lifestyle also completely collapsed. With the illicit financial lifeline from his parents permanently severed by the court's freezing orders, his primary credit cards were instantly declined. He was currently drowning in massive personal debt, facing aggressive collection agencies completely alone and without any financial resources. His elite social circle had entirely ostracized him, actively refusing to associate with a family involved in such a despicable, highly publicized elder exploitation scandal. He was left completely isolated in the ruins of his fabricated success, a fitting punishment for his complicit silence. Martha, meanwhile, had rapidly regained both her physical health and her vibrant joy for life. Surrounded by professional medical care and comprehensive security protocols, she was finally enjoying absolute unrestricted freedom. She never had to monitor anyone's toxic mood, endure psychological manipulation, or seek permission for basic necessities ever again. She lived safely and peacefully alongside me, the only granddaughter who genuinely loved her and actively fought for her survival. Standing next to her on the spacious balcony as she watered her vibrant potted plants, I reflected on the brutal but necessary reality of our situation before officially closing this dark chapter of my life forever. The Revenge Mode channel produces these narratives for purely educational purposes, illustrating the critical importance of establishing strict personal boundaries. We aim to demonstrate how victims can successfully navigate severe family crises by utilizing absolute rationality, solid evidence, and uncompromising legal frameworks over emotional reactions. The investigator acted with absolute, unwavering decisiveness to protect her vulnerable grandmother, permanently severing all familial ties with her abusive relatives without a single moment of hesitation or reconciliation. Consequently, the perpetrators are now facing the inevitable devastating legal and financial ruin that directly resulted from their own greedy, malicious decisions and arrogant assumptions. Looking back at this destructive family ordeal, there are profound truths regarding greed, boundaries, and self-respect that we must all acknowledge and remember. Greed is a highly toxic poison capable of eroding even the closest blood relationships. You must never underestimate the malicious silence of a manipulative relative, just as you should never underestimate the quiet strength of someone protecting their family. A harmless facade is often the sharpest, most effective shield against exploitation. Sharing blood does not automatically make someone your family. When toxic relatives attempt to cross your personal limits for their own selfish financial gain, the most effective method of self-protection is drawing an unyielding legal boundary. True self-respect means refusing to tolerate abuse and showing absolutely no mercy to those who intentionally exploit your kindness and trust. Thank you sincerely for patiently listening to the very end of this intense journey on Revenge Mode. Your continued support is our greatest motivation. What do you think about the main character's uncompromising decision to use the full force of the law against her own family? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and we will see you in the next story.